I am the bodyguard of a mafia boss. The boss's son, who just returned from abroad, turns out to be my ex-boyfriend. The boss asked, "Do you know each other?" I replied, "Not really." That night, he lifted my shirt and whispered, "Not really? Brother, we're already way too familiar." I had a cigarette dangling from my lips, staring at the wall with half-lidded eyes as he pinned me against it. 5 years apart, and he's taller now, broader too. The young man's hand slid down to my waist, still not stopping, exploring lower and lower. Any further, and we'd have a problem. I narrowed my eyes, grabbed his wandering hand, and warned him in a low voice, "Enough." Mark Salem didn't resist. His palm rested shamelessly near my groin, and he leaned his head against my shoulder, laughing. "Brother, your body's telling me it missed me a lot." His tone was smug, full of audacious confidence, the kind of arrogance I had spoiled him into. I pulled his hand away, slowly buckling my belt. If anyone else touched me like that, I'd still enjoy it. I grabbed his head and lifted it off my shoulder, taking a good look at him. Still so beautiful. That face could drive me to ruin. But I'd already fallen for those looks once. Getting caught up again would make me the world's biggest idiot. I lightly patted Mark Salem's cheek and smiled. You're really nothing special. Once bitten by a snake, you'll fear a rope for 10 years. Mark Salem is that snake. The year I met Mark Salem, he was just 18, wearing a crisp white shirt and a blue school uniform, playing the drums in a band at a bar with perfect posture. Among a crowd of flashy, flamboyant people, he stood out the most. That unique blend of innocence and boldness was irresistibly captivating. At the time, I had just gotten out of prison and was working as a bouncer at the bar. In one night, I got into 7 fights, all because of Mark Salem. That kid could casually toss a ring or bracelet off the stage, and it would spark a brawl. One night, his habit of lighting fires and leaving them to burn caught up with him. On his way home, he got cornered by a group of drunks. By chance, I was passing through the alley and ended up saving his life. The kid's collar had been torn, and there was a slap mark on his face. As he leaned against the wall, watching me fight for him, he cheered me on like it was some kind of show. At that moment, I thought to myself, how can this troublemaker be such a tease? I knocked the 2 drunks to the ground. Mark sauntered over, slow and unbothered, and kicked one of them right in the crotch. "Still want to mess with your grandpa?" he sneered. The guy screamed in pain. I sucked in a breath and pulled Mark back. "That's enough," I said. Mark immediately switched to a sweet smile and said, "Thanks for tonight, brother." Then, without missing a beat, he turned and kicked the other guy before sticking his tongue out at me. 1 each, fair and square. I laughed out of sheer frustration and turned to leave. Why bother with him? But Mark Salem followed me all the way to my apartment building. "Brother, I've got nowhere to go," he said. "You saved me, so why not take me in for the night?" I asked about his parents. He replied, "Both gone." I looked at his pretty face and felt my heart soften. That moment of weakness led to more than just letting him stay the night. It led to letting him stay in my bed. When Mark Salem wanted to seduce someone, it was like second nature to him. He cornered me in the bathroom and asked, "Brother, they all want me. Don't you?" Then he tilted his head and kissed my chin. "I won't let them have me. I'll only let you." Who could resist that? Honestly, from the first time I saw Mark on that stage at the bar, I'd already imagined everything I wanted to do to him. And now, here he was, saying those words to my face. How could I hold back? Later, when we ended up in bed, Mark lay on top of me, saying he was scared it would hurt. Feeling bad for him because he was so young, I let him take the lead instead. But when you spoil someone once, there's always a second time. When he went too far, Mark pinned me against the staircase wall in the bar and bit the back of my neck with his canines. "Don't let anyone else hear this," he said. The music in the bar was loud enough to drown out everything. No one could possibly hear us. But Mark Salem liked playing these games. He thought it was thrilling, and I didn't mind indulging him. Once or twice, it was easy to pull away. But the more we slept together, the more my feelings changed. The moment I realized I had fallen for him, I told Mark, either we're in a relationship, or we end this. Mark looked at me with that dazzling smile of his and said, "Brother, haven't we always been in a relationship? I gave you my first time. Do you still think I'd just leave you?" At the time, Mark was only 18. In his senior year of high school, he was too young to think about the future, but I couldn't afford not to. I had a criminal record. My life was already a mess. But Mark had his whole future ahead of him. I couldn't let him ruin it by sticking with me, wasting away in the back streets and alleys. I started keeping him in check, urging him to focus on his studies. Mark listened. He stopped messing around and worked hard to prepare for the college entrance exams. To keep him at ease, I quit my job at the bar, cooked 3 meals a day for him, and supported him as he studied. At that time, I gave him my entire heart, leaving nothing for myself. But Mark Salem deceived me. When an old colleague told me they had seen him in a private club, I didn't believe it, until I saw it with my own eyes. I watched him walk out of the club with a group of rich young men. Following behind, I overheard their conversation. "Hey, aren't you tired of that delivery guy yet? You should cut him loose. I think that guy actually wants to pay your way through college." Another voice chimed in. "Does our young Master Salem even need college? He's heading abroad in July." "Hey, young Master Salem, how's that muscle guy in bed?" "Good. I've never tried that type before." Mark Salem shot him a glance, took a drag from his scarlet-tipped cigarette, and said, "Open your mouth." Then he pressed the burning cigarette against the man's tongue. "If you can't speak properly, then don't." At that moment, I wanted to rush over and beat Mark up, but in the end, I just pulled out my phone and called him. Mark looked at the screen but didn't answer. The person next to him asked, "Young Master Salem, why aren't you picking up?" Mark frowned, irritation written all over his face. In a low voice, he said, "To controlling." The ringtone stopped, so I called again. Mark Salem sighed, put on a bright smile, and answered sweetly, "Brother." It almost made me laugh out loud. The guy could outdo an opera performer with how quickly he could switch faces. Such a good act. I said, "Mark, turn around." Pain shot through my wrist, dragging my thoughts back to the present. Mark Salem was gripping my wrist tightly, his strength undeniable. "Who's touched you? Who are you comparing me to now? Brother, have you tried many others these past years?" His tone was soft, and his eyelashes trembled slightly. It felt like if I said yes, he'd break down crying right then and there. I shook him off and laughed lightly. "None of your business." "It's definitely my business," Mark Salem said, his eyes narrowing, a flush creeping up the corners of his gaze. "Brother, you're mine. Only mine. You can't try anyone else." Before I responded, suddenly, there was the sound of something smashing downstairs, followed by Mason Salem's irritable voice. "Where's Brother Bill? I want Bill Wilson. Get him here. Right now. Tell him I'm having an episode and make him come." Mason Salem was my boss Thomas Salem's youngest son, and Mark Salem's little brother. 4 years ago, he was captured by enemies and nearly lost his life. I happened to be the one who saved him. Though his life was spared, his legs were crippled. Because of that incident, Thomas Salem brought me into the Salem family as a bodyguard. Perhaps it was because I'd saved Mason Salem in such a dangerous situation. But his reliance on me bordered on pathological. When he was first brought back, he even demanded I stay with him 24/7. If I wasn't around, he'd become restless, sometimes even go completely out of control. I shoved Mark Salem aside and rushed downstairs. By the time I got to the living room, everything Mason Salem could throw had already been smashed to pieces. He clung tightly to his wheelchair, breathing heavily, his emotions spiraling out of control. I strode over, knelt down in front of Mason Salem, and said softly, "Young Master, I'm here." The moment Mason Salem saw me, tears welled up in his eyes. His body visibly relaxed as he whimpered, "Brother Bill, where did you go? I couldn't find you. I had a nightmare, and no matter where I looked, you weren't there." "I'm here now. Don't be scared," I murmured, lifting him out of the wheelchair and carrying him upstairs. "I'll stay with the young master until you sleep." Mark Salem stood on the second-floor landing, his head bowed, his back ramrod straight. As I passed him, he tugged at the hem of my shirt, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "Brother." Mason Salem shrank against my chest, burying his head while his arms tightened around my neck. I shook off Mark Salem's grip and continued upstairs. Before falling asleep, Mason Salem clung tightly to my hand and stubbornly said, "Brother Bill, don't leave me, okay?" He was even younger than Mark Salem. His feelings were easy to read, just a child's possessiveness. I stroked his head and replied, "I won't leave." "Now sleep?" Later in the night, my boss, Thomas Salem, called. "Mark's in trouble," he said. Apparently, Mark had taken off in the middle of the night to race cars with some enemies. The opposition had tampered with his vehicle, and Mark's car nearly went over a cliff. Things had spiraled out of control, and the two sides were now fighting. "I'm stuck here in D-City and can't get away. Bill, you go check it out." When I arrived at Eagle's Head Mountain with reinforcements, chaos was already in full swing. Mark Salem, bloodied and furious, was holding a knife, about to stab it into young Master Pullman's eye. I cursed under my breath and shouted, "Mark Salem, stop." Rushing over, I grabbed his hand and said firmly, "Calm down." Mark's tense muscles slowly began to relax. He lifted his blood-smeared face and said to me, "Brother, I almost died just now. Taking one of his eyes isn't asking too much, is it? He chuckled softly and let go of the knife. But if brother doesn't want me to get revenge, I'll give it up. Brother, I'll listen to you. He tilted his head obediently, his bright eyes shimmering like a puppy waiting for its owner's praise. You like it best when I listen to you. The way he looked at me then, it was as if I were his entire world, someone who could bully him, crush him, and possess him as I pleased. But it was all an act. My throat tightened as I swallowed hard and averted my gaze. I took Mark's knife, shoved him behind me, and glanced round until I found a steel pipe. Before that Pullman guy could get up, I swung the pipe hard at the back of his knees. Revenge still needed to be exacted, just not by Mark Salem. After all, I was hired by the Salem family to handle the dirty work. I tossed a business card onto the writhing Pullman's chest. Call this number. The Salem family will cover your medical bills. Get treated properly. Don't end up crippled. Dropping the pipe, I grabbed Mark Salem and dragged him away. The moment we got into the car, he pinned me against the driver's seat. Like an overzealous dog, he lunged at me, biting and kissing, his hands feverishly roaming my body, messing up my clothes in the process. I struggled against him. Mark Salem seemed enraged, gripping my arms tightly, his strength overwhelming. He refused to let me resist. From boy to man, there was a difference. 5 years ago, Mark Salem could never have pinned me down this easily. Now, we were evenly matched. As he kissed me wildly, he muttered nonsense. I knew it. Brother wouldn't leave me. You still love me. You're mine. From my lips to my chin, then down to my neck, his kisses were rough, almost painful, but more intoxicating than anything. As he said, we knew each other's bodies all too well. Damn it, if this kept going, he'd have his way with me again. When his mouth reached my abdomen, I yanked his hair, pulling him up, and punched him in the face. Get off me. Mark licked his bloodied lips and grabbed my hand, guiding it lower. Brother, touch me. Feel how much I want you. Grinding his teeth, he hissed, I want you so badly I'm about to explode. I grabbed him by the neck and pushed him away. Stop pretending to be so devoted. Mark Salem, don't forget, it was you who left first. Back then, my indulgence toward Mark Salem had reached absurd levels. Thinking about it now, it's laughable. That night, when Mark turned and saw me, his face instantly went pale. I watched the panic flash across his expression and threw my phone at him, yelling, Mark, I'm done with you. Get out of my life. As I turned to leave, it felt like a gaping hole had been torn in my chest. Mark Salem ran after me, grabbing me tightly, his scalding tears falling onto my neck. Brother, you heard everything, didn't you? Those weren't my true feelings. I didn't mean to not come home. I'll listen to you. I swear I'll listen from now on. He trembled with fear, kissing my neck and ears desperately. Brother, don't leave me. And yet, he had the audacity to cry, to cling to me and refuse to let go. But the one who should have been crying was me. I shoved him away and said, Mark, can you stop playing with me? I was 28. All I wanted was someone to spend my life with. I couldn't keep playing games. At that time, I really did love Mark Salem. Even knowing he was a liar, I still loved him. But I couldn't kneel at his feet and let him trample all over me. I was a person, and yet Mark Salem wouldn't let me go. He had a knack for entangling himself in my life, squatting pitifully at my doorstep like a stray dog, refusing to leave no matter what I did. He deliberately drank spiked alcohol at the bar, intentionally let someone try to take him away in front of me, knowing it would enrage me. I'd fight for him, charging to save him, only for him to laugh and kiss me after. If you didn't come, I would have killed them all and turned myself in, he'd say. I tremble with rage. Mark Salem, have to destroy yourself. Mark Salem, feverish and burning, would kiss my ears, my throat, and whisper, if you don't care about me, I'll destroy myself. If you don't want me, leave me here with someone else. I couldn't leave. I couldn't just stand by and watch him with someone else. Mark Salem was like opium. Once you're hooked, there's no escape. I knew he was full of lies, manipulative to his core, yet I still dove in head first, as if I were possessed. At 18, Mark Salem had pressed me against the door, kissed my abdomen, knelt before me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and like a devout worshiper, promised, brother, I'll never leave you for the rest of my life. Please forgive me, okay? I gripped his hair tightly and thought to myself, forget it. I can't let him go. I stitched up the wound in my heart haphazardly and told myself, just one more chance. Just one. But at the height of my addiction, Mark Salem left. Without a word, he vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. The promises he made, they were nothing but empty words. I didn't mean to. Back then, Mark Salem's voice was frantic, trying to explain. I cut him off. I don't want to hear it. None of it mattered anymore. When I'd wanted to hear his explanation, he wouldn't give it to me. Now, I didn't want to listen. I adjusted my clothes and asked, I just want to know. Did you know the car had issues before you agreed to that race? Mark Salem laughed lightly, openly admitting, yes. He'd known it was rigged and still got in, playing with his life just to bait me. This was a trick Mark Salem was all too familiar with. He liked standing on the edge of the cliff on purpose, watching me panic, watching me fight for him. I'd be worried sick, while he'd stand there smug and proud. That feeling must have been thrilling for him. The way a slight tug on the reins could send me spiraling, watching me run circles like a dog chasing its tail. It was truly vile. 5 years, and you're still putting on the same act. Aren't you tired of playing this game, Mark? What are you trying to prove? That I still have feelings for you. I turned my head to look at him. Let me tell you the truth. If it weren't for boss's orders, I wouldn't have even looked at you tonight. Mark, you're no longer important. If you want to die, go die somewhere far away. Don't drag me into your mess. The smile on Mark Salem's face slowly faded. If I'm not important, then who is? Mason Salem. His voice rose, his eyes red and his emotions spiraling out of control. You've fallen for him, haven't you? That's why you don't want me anymore. He was rambling now, his words growing more spiteful. What's so good about him? He's not better looking than me, and he's a cripple. Can he make you feel good? Do you really get turned on by looking at him like that? Or is it just that you have a thing for 18-year-olds? I raised my hand and slapped him hard across the face, shaking with anger. Shut up. Mason Salem is your brother. Mark, if you want to degrade me, fine. But don't drag him down with you. Mark Salem's head turned with the force of the slap, his disheveled black hair falling over his eyes. He didn't move for a long time. After a while, he raised a hand, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, and said softly, Mason Salem is not my brother. He lifted his head, his dark eyes eerily calm like the still surface of a deep, cold lake. Brother, have you given your heart to him? What's mine? You gave it to him. He doesn't deserve you. I'll make sure you see it. The only one worthy of you is me. By the time we returned to the Salem family estate, it was already early morning. At 4 o'clock, the sky was still dark, but the living room lights were on. Mason Salem was sitting there, staring blankly at the television. When he heard movement, he turned his head sharply. His eyes lit up when he saw me. Brother Bill, you're back. Mark Salem followed behind me, standing just a step away. Mason Salem's grip tightened on the armrest, his expression uneasy as he forced out a greeting, brother. Mark Salem didn't even lift his eyelids. I walked quickly over to Mason, crouching in front of him. Why are you up so early? Mason dropped his gaze, looking a little sad. I woke up in the middle of the night, and you weren't here. I couldn't fall back asleep. I felt a pang of guilt. I had promised Mason Salem last night that I'd stay with him, but I had broken that promise. Mason's eyes scanned my face intently, and then he suddenly reached up and touched my lips. Brother Bill, why are your lips swollen? His cold fingertips brushed against the heat of my lips, and something about the gesture felt off. I kissed him. Mark leaned over me from behind, shoving Mason's hand away as he spoke. Look a little closer. His tongue might be swollen too. Mason's lips tightened, and he stared at Mark Salem, his face turning pale. Stop joking around. Brother Bill is a man, and so are you. How could you? I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to slam Mark Salem's head into the wall. I reached out to Mason Salem and said, Don't listen to him. Let me carry you upstairs so you can rest a bit more. Before I could touch him, Mark Salem suddenly kicked Mason's wheelchair a short distance away, stepped past me, and hoisted Mason onto his shoulder. I'll take him upstairs to sleep. Then, glancing back at me, he added, Brother, you've had a long night. Go get some rest. Mason struggled helplessly and called out to me, pleading, Brother Bill. I didn't move, letting Mark carry him away. Mason couldn't keep relying on me like this. After all, I was an outsider. Boss Salem had hinted at this before, saying, Bill, you can't stay with Mason forever. Some hurdles he'll have to face on his own. Over the past year, I've been intentionally distancing myself from Mason Salem. Last night was just an exception because he had been so out of control. When Boss Salem returned to H-City, he gradually handed over some of his authority to Mark Salem and told me, Bill, Mark is reckless. Keep an eye on him for me, so I can rest easy. Reckless was an understatement. Mark didn't care about his life. His methods were too ruthless, too extreme, and it often made enemies. Even though the Salem family had transitioned into legitimate business, Their circles were still mostly reformed mobsters. When pushed too far, violence wasn't uncommon. Mark Salem had been attacked in retaliation several times, often barely surviving. The worst incident left him with a knife wound to the stomach, and he spent 3 months recovering in the hospital. One day, while smoking outside, I said to him, "I'm begging you, Mark. Value your life a little." Mark Salem, pale and still weak, grinned mischievously. "One kiss from brother, and I'll value my life. A kiss to make him behave. A kiss to keep him out of bars. A kiss to make him stay." It was all his little schemes. I lowered my gaze and said coldly, "Mark, stop acting pathetic." The 6 months I spent trailing after Mark Salem felt longer than 3 years. Running around all day. I rarely even returned to the Salem house. On Boss Salem's birthday, a banquet was held at the house. The lights were bright inside, but I crouched in the backyard, smoking. Suddenly, I heard someone call my name. "Brother Bill." I looked up and saw Mason Salem sitting on the second-floor windowsill. "Brother Bill, if I jump from here, can you catch me?" I nearly swallowed my cigarette. Pointing at him, I said, "Don't move. Wait for me to come up." I dashed upstairs and pulled him off the windowsill, sweat already forming on my forehead. Before I could open my mouth to scold him, Mason suddenly threw his arms around my waist, holding me tightly. 142 days, he said. "Brother Bill, it's been 142 days since you last came to see me." My throat tightened, and I croaked, "I'm sorry, I've been busy." I had been busy, but I was also deliberately avoiding him. "Brother Bill, if only my legs worked." Warm tears seeped into my shirt. "Then I wouldn't have to wait here for you to come to me. I could grab hold of you myself, just like Brother Mark does." Feeling overheated, I tried to push him away. "Young master, let go of me first." But Mason's warm hand suddenly slipped under my shirt, pressing against the small of my back. "Brother Bill," he murmured softly, "whatever Mark can do, I can too. Please, care for me." It hit me suddenly. My body felt unnaturally hot, and I couldn't even muster the strength to push him away. In my earlier panic, I hadn't noticed the faint, strange scent lingering in the room. Judging by the symptoms, it was likely some kind of aphrodisiac. Mason left a trail of damp kisses across my abdomen, his trembling hands clinging to me as he wept and pleaded, "Don't push me away, Brother Bill. I'm begging you." I grabbed Mason's hand, but before I could say anything, the door was suddenly kicked open from the outside. When Mark Salem appeared, he immediately yanked me behind him by the arm and threw a punch at Mason's face, knocking him out of his wheelchair and onto the floor. Without hesitation, he raised his leg to kick him. I shouted, "Mark Salem," and grabbed his arm firmly. Mark paused mid-kick and didn't follow through. Still facing away from me, he said, "Brother, could you not protect him in front of me like this?" Turning his head slightly, his bloodshot eyes glinted. "I won't hit him anymore. Just don't play the hero for anyone else, all right?" I had no patience for his nonsense right now. Struggling to maintain control over myself, I tugged on his wrist and, gasping for breath, said, "Call a doctor. Give me a shot." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he lifted me up and carried me out. Behind us, Mason screamed, "Don't you dare leave. Bill Wilson, you're not allowed to go with him." Even in my fevered state, I had enough clarity to realize what Mark Salem intended. Gritting my teeth, I spoke slowly and firmly, "Mark, call a doctor." Mark Salem replied, "I am the doctor." By the time we reached his room, I was completely consumed by the heat. When Mark leaned in to kiss me, I turned the tables, slamming him against the door. My fingers threaded through his hair, gripping the back of his head as I claimed his lips, tongues clashing in a heated battle. Mark, like he was under the same spell, responded even more frantically, tearing at my clothes, kissing my ears, neck, and collarbone as he murmured, "Brother, I missed you so much." We were like wild beasts, devouring each other. We didn't even make it to the bed. The next morning, buttons were scattered everywhere, our clothes strewn from the doorway to the windowsill, and furniture lay toppled across the room. Mark Salem was gone. I stood by the window, smoking a cigarette. My phone buzzed with a message from Boss Salem. "Come to the ancestral hall on the 3rd floor." I went there. Inside, Mark Salem knelt upright, his posture rigid. Boss Salem sat on a nearby sofa, a rattan whip resting beside him. Fighting between brothers, he said coldly, "Mark, is this how you act as a brother? Brother?" Mark Salem sneered, his tone icy. "You've forgotten. I'm an only child. My mother only gave birth to me." Thomas Salem lowered his gaze, his voice calm yet commanding. "If you won't admit your mistake, then accept your punishment." He handed the whip to me and said, "Do it." I hesitated, opening my mouth to speak. "Boss, last night, it wasn't Mark's fault." Thomas Salem looked up at me, his tone unwavering. Bill, do it. Lowering my eyes, I answered, yes, sir. There was no need for explanations. Thomas Salem knew everything. This was the Salem family's way. He knew exactly what had happened last night, but he wanted to reprimand Mark, protect Mason, and give me a subtle warning in the process. 100 lashes. Mark Salem didn't flinch once, his back ramrod straight, not uttering a single sound. By the end, I was drenched in sweat, more so than Mark himself. Mark leaned against me for support as he stood up, his body trembling. He looked at Thomas Salem and said, "Are we done? Can I leave now?" I supported Mark as we walked out of the ancestral hall. He stayed silent, seemingly lost in thought. At the corner of the third-floor hallway, he suddenly pressed down on my shoulder and leaned close to my ear. "Brother, should I buy you a whip?" he whispered, his voice low and slightly hoarse, tinged with a faint blush. "Next time I don't behave, you can just whip me." Then, with an audacious grin, he added, "Just now, knowing it was you whipping me, felt really good." I said flatly, "Mark, stop fooling around." After dropping Mark off in his room, my phone buzzed again with a message from Thomas Salem. Study room. Gripping my phone tightly, I stood outside for a moment before pushing the door open. "I thought you said you weren't close to him." Thomas Salem leaned against the balcony railing, beckoning me over with a flick of his hand. I walked up to him. He tilted his head, reached out and brushed aside my collar, rubbing the faint bruises on my neck left by Mark's kisses. His tone was calm as he said, "He nearly kissed you raw. Why is it okay with Mark, but not with Mason? Mason had drugged me, and I ended up in bed with Mark." As expected, Thomas knew everything that had happened last night. I replied, "It was an accident." Half of Mark Salem's beauty came from Thomas Salem. If you turn back the clock 20-something years, Thomas likely looked very similar to Mark now. However, Thomas had reached an age where his sharp edges were hidden beneath a layer of calm composure. But underneath that exterior, he was just as much of a madman. "Bill, 3 years ago, you told me you were only here to be a bodyguard." Thomas's hand moved upward, gripping my jaw as he continued. "And now you've ended up in bed with my son." Thomas Salem swung both ways, keeping a slew of lovers outside the family. 3 years ago, after a night of drinking, he'd ask me, "Bill, want to try it with me?" I turned him down. Lovers were lovers, bodyguards were bodyguards. Thomas Salem kept those lines very clear. He didn't need me in particular for him. I was just a fleeting interest. When you've reached his position, you've seen all kinds of lovers, and there's no need to force anyone. Since I insisted on being a bodyguard, he treated me as one and never brought it up again. But now, I'd slept with Mark under his nose, so much for just being a bodyguard. I said, "Boss, I can resign." Thomas Salem laughed and let go of me. "Don't be ridiculous. You've followed me for so many years. If you want to leave, that depends on whether I'm willing to let you go." I understood all too well that once you stepped into the Salem family's world, there was no getting out. "Keep an eye on Mark for me," Thomas said, straightening my collar. "Don't let him get himself killed. I still need him to carry on the family line." Lowering his gaze, he added, "You can play around, but don't take it seriously." Thomas claimed he wanted me to watch over Mark, yet he sent him away on a month-long assignment. Thomas Salem dragged me along to all sorts of social gatherings. In one private room, I drank until my head was spinning. Thomas patted the boy sitting on his lap and tilted his chin toward me. The boy glanced at me, then walked over and asked, "Sir, would you like some water?" I lifted my eyelids and gave him a brief look before my gaze shifted to Thomas. He sat under the dim light, his face obscured by a haze of smoke, watching me coldly and intently. This wasn't about hospitality. He didn't trust me. He was worried I'd cling to Mark Salem, so he was offering me someone else. Lowering my gaze, I drank the water from the boy's hand. I was hasty, and the water spilled down the corner of my lips. The boy leaned in, ready to lick it away. I blocked his mouth with my hand and asked, "Did you just kiss someone else?" "Someone else was." "Of course, Thomas." The boy's eyes widened. "Are you saying you're disgusted by me?" I chuckled lightly and said politely, "Sorry, but yes, a bit." The boy stamped his foot and ran back to Thomas to complain. I leaned back lazily, thinking it was all pointless. Neither his figure nor his face could compare. Damn it, Mark had spoiled me. After deflecting a few more rounds of drinks on Thomas's behalf, I escaped to the restroom to throw up. When I finished washing my face and looked up, Thomas was standing behind me, holding out a handkerchief. I stared at his well-defined fingers in the mirror, but didn't take it. Thomas stepped forward, grabbed my chin, and began dabbing at my face. I flinched, but he said calmly, "Don't move." The handkerchief glided over my forehead, then my brows, nose, and lips. Eric says you think he's dirty. Eric must have been that boy. I didn't respond. Is it because he's dirty? Or because he kissed me, and you think I'm dirty? I avoided the question and said, Boss, if you keep wiping, my face will fall apart. Thomas chuckled, tossed the handkerchief onto the sink, and shoved me hard against the countertop. With one hand gripping the back of my neck, and the other reaching for my belt, he pinned me down. I didn't resist. If Thomas was determined to have his way with me, my skills wouldn't matter. Boss, do you know why Mark has been so reckless since he came back? I said. Thomas didn't respond, his focus unmoving as he unzipped my pants. It's because he's trying to win your approval. He wants you to notice him just once. 5 years ago, you forced Mark's head down and sent him overseas, but you kept Mason here. At the time, H-City's power dynamics were shifting. It was dangerous. You couldn't watch over both sons, so you chose to protect one and abandon the other. You gave up on Mark and picked Mason. Thomas's hand paused momentarily, but his expression didn't change. You wanted to groom Mason to be your heir, but fate didn't go your way. You couldn't keep Mason safe. He was kidnapped, crippled, and lost his chance to be the successor. Reluctantly, you had no choice but to call Mark back. If it weren't for that, Mark would have never been allowed to return. Isn't that right? After 4 years in the Salem family, I'd heard enough rumors to piece things together. Thomas Salem lifted his head and looked at me through the mirror, his gaze icy. I met his eyes and said, I've figured all of this out. Do you think Mark doesn't understand? He does, but he's stupid. Even now, he still believes that if he achieves something, you might look at him differently. Might finally see him as your son. Thomas Salem's brow twitched. No matter how distant, blood ties remain blood ties. I pressed on, Boss, I could sleep with you tonight, or with anyone else. You could use me as a weapon to destroy Mark Salem. It wouldn't matter, because you don't care whether he lives or dies. Thomas grabbed me by the neck from behind and said, Bill Wilson, don't overestimate your importance. It's not me overestimating my importance. It's you who overestimates me, I replied, prying his hand off. Boss, when you sent Mark abroad, did he beg you? For a brief moment, Thomas's expression darkened and his gaze faltered. I freed myself and lowered my eyes to fasten my belt. Did he kneel to you? Was that the first time he lowered his head and pleaded with you not to send him away? Thomas didn't respond. I had worked with him for 4 years and knew that silence meant I had struck a nerve. A dull ache spread through my chest, as if I'd been pierced, not sharp, but persistent and maddening. It made me want to punch my boss. Taking a deep breath, I pushed Thomas Salem away and couldn't resist stabbing him with my words. No wonder Mark told me the first time we met that his parents were dead. What's the difference, really? I had thoroughly angered Thomas. He sent me away on assignments for 3 months, dragging me across the country. By the time I returned to H-City, I tanned a shade darker. The moment I stepped off the plane, Thomas sent me a message. Heaven Residence, room 1001. Pick up Mark. The private room was chaotic. Even when I opened the door, no one paid attention. I scanned the room twice before spotting Mark Salem. He was slumped on a sofa, holding a bottle of alcohol. 2 young men flanked him, feeding him drinks from their glasses. Whatever they gave him, he drank. Afterward, one of them started unbuttoning his shirt, leaning closer as if to kiss him. Mark leaned back, unmoving. I loosened my tie and strode over. The boy was practically draped over Mark, cupping his face and coaxing him. Yes, I'm your brother. I'm right here. Does young Master Salem want me? I laughed in anger. You're his brother? Then what does that make me? Before the boy could respond, I shoved him aside. Kneeling on one knee by the sofa, I braced a hand on the backrest and lightly patted Mark's face. Boss sent me to fetch you. Are you coming with me? Mark's unfocused eyes roamed my face before his hand reached up to touch it. In a soft voice, he asked, Brother, why don't you want me anymore? He was completely out of it. The alcohol here had probably been laced with something. I hoisted him up and carried him out. Once I got him into the car, Mark suddenly grabbed my collar, pulling me down and kissed me. I froze for a moment before pressing his head down and kissing him back. This little brat, flirting and throwing himself around like that, tempting everyone to take a piece. Might as well kiss him to death myself. Mark turned the tables, pinning me against the car seat as he kissed me feverishly. From my lips to my Adam's apple, he moved slowly downward. With his eyes closed, he murmured my name, tears streaming down his face. He looked utterly broken, as though he was in unbearable pain. He probably didn't even know who he was kissing. If I hadn't come, he might have ended up in bed with just anyone tonight, calling out my name, crying, and kissing someone else. Could I blame him for that? Could I say he didn't love me? That's what I'm most afraid of. Mark Salem is too reckless. He's extreme, careless with himself, and treats his own life like it doesn't matter. If I don't keep an eye on him, he doesn't care whether he falls apart or not. Being with someone like that is exhausting. I'm constantly on edge, terrified that the moment I take my eyes off him, something will go wrong. Mark Salem isn't going to change. It was already the middle of the night. I didn't take Mark home. Instead, I got us a hotel room to make do for the night. The next morning, I woke up early. After washing up, I noticed Mark Salem was still asleep. I decided to leave quietly. But when I reached for my phone by the bed, my wrist was suddenly grabbed, and I was pulled onto the bed. A warm body pressed against me as Mark Salem pinned me down, burying his head in the crook of my neck. Brother, have you and Thomas Salem ever slept together? My whole body froze. Why would Mark Salem ask that? Before I could answer, Mark suddenly bit my neck. I hissed sharply at the pain. Brother, just say no. Lie to me if you have to. The crook of my neck felt wet. He was crying. Please, just say no, and I'll convince myself to forgive you. I sighed. Who told you that? Mark's body stiffened for a moment. Then he abruptly got out of bed without a word, started getting dressed, and even took the gun I had tucked at my lower back. Before he could leave, I grabbed his arm. Where are you going? Mark gave me a cold look. To kill Thomas Salem. My temples throbbed. I haven't slept with Thomas Salem. I'm asking you, who fed you that rumor? Do you understand me? Mark's eyes immediately reddened. Stop lying to me. He pulled a photo out of his pocket and threw it at me. It was a picture of me and Thomas Salem in a club bathroom. In the image, Thomas had me pinned, unbuckling my belt. It looked unmistakably intimate. The photo also had Thomas's head scribbled over in anger. Not many people could have taken a photo like this. It had to be either Thomas himself or Mason. Thomas doing something like this was unlikely. He wouldn't risk turning his son against him. So that left. Mason gave this to you? I asked. Mark glared at me furiously, confirming my suspicion. Looking at his betrayed, pitiful expression, I couldn't help but find it a little funny. Relax. We didn't sleep together. My pants didn't even come off. Then what's with the photo? I couldn't explain it to him, so I simply said, it's not what it looks like. Mark wasn't satisfied with my answer. His eyes widened, and tears began streaming down his face. Brother, you're so heartless. You can't even be bothered to explain to me anymore. You don't love me anymore. I laughed in exasperation. Mark, which one of us is truly heartless? I snapped, my suppressed anger flaring up. You lied to me. You left for another country without a word. And when you came back, you wouldn't stop clinging to me. Mason gives you a photo, and you jump to conclusions without even asking me. Then you run off to get drunk. If I hadn't gone to get you last night, you wouldn't even know who was in your bed this morning. Luckily, I don't love you anymore. If I still did, you'd shred my heart to pieces and feed it to the dogs. By the end, my throat felt tight, and my eyes stung. Mark panicked, fumbling to wrap his arms around me. No, brother, that's not true. I wasn't drunk. I knew it was you. The moment you walked through the door, I saw you. I was pretending. I wanted to make you jealous. Please don't be angry. I'm yours. I'd never let anyone else into my bed. I'm not stupid. Of course I knew who was kissing me. If I ever dared to be with someone else, you'd have left me long ago. Faint. I was even angrier now. I punched Mark, knocking him to the ground, then gave him a swift kick for good measure. Fun, isn't it? After finishing everything and returning to the Salem house, I reported back to Thomas Salem. In the study, he leaned back in his chair and said, Bill, take over the D-City project. I replied, thank you, boss. As I was leaving, he added, it's best if you don't return to H-City. I nodded and left. Passing through the garden, I saw Mason Salem sitting on the windowsill on the second floor. He timidly called out, Brother Bill. I turned back. Mason smiled at me, beautiful but pale. If I jumped from here, would you catch me? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment and replied, Mason, no one can catch you. That's your own fate. Then I turned and walked away, catching a faint I'm sorry carried by the wind. Mason didn't necessarily like me. He just saw me as his possession, something that was his, and he didn't want to share it with Mark Salem. D-City wasn't big, much smaller than H-City. Thomas Salem had acquired a few factories here, and I was appointed general manager, which could be considered a promotion. When Mark came to find me, I was shirtless, helping a group of workers carry goods, purely because I had nothing better to do. Thomas Salem sent you here to be a manager, not a laborer, he said. I didn't respond, wiping my sweat with a towel. Mark started criticizing my office. The desk was bad, the chair was worse. And even the small ornaments on the shelf got an elaborate critique. Exasperated, I washed my face and asked, "What do you want?" Mark Salem stared at me. "I want you to come back to H-City with me." "No," I said. Mark was furious. "Look at the life you're living here. You were already tan, and now you're even darker. When you stood in front of me just now, I almost mistook you for a human-shaped chocolate bar." He reached out to touch my buzz cut, sighing in regret. "You even shaved your head. Your old hairstyle was so much cooler. Now, if I put you in a field, I wouldn't be able to tell you apart from a farmer." I almost laughed. Looking at him, I said, "Young master, this is who I really am. This life suits me. Just because I wore a suit and tie for a while doesn't mean I'm the same as you. I'm lucky. I've made it to general manager, which is already better than most people. I live comfortably here, far better than in the Salem house. I've spent most of my life toiling in the wind and rain. All I want now is to settle down and live my days peacefully. H-City is too big. It doesn't suit me." Mark Salem stopped complaining. After a long silence, he lowered his eyes and said quietly, "But I miss you so much." I swallowed hard and turned my head away. "Forget about me sooner rather than later. Boss is waiting for you to carry on the family line." Mark lifted his eyes, gazing at me with the ghost of a smirk. "Brother, sometimes I really want to kiss your mouth until it's ruined." Then he pounced on me, kissing me. "Carry on the family line. I'll make sure Thomas Salem has no heirs." I grabbed his hair, dodging his lips. "Didn't you say I look like a chocolate bar?" Mark started undoing my pants and grinned. "I love chocolate. Now hurry and let me have a bite." Mark once told me that the day his mother was captured by Thomas Salem's enemies, Thomas was at his lover's side, waiting for Mason to be born. By the time Thomas Salem went to rescue her, it was too late. She was already dead. Mark hated Thomas, and Thomas didn't care for Mark either. Mark held me tightly, as if he was afraid I'd vanish. "Brother, no one loves me, no one cares about me, no one protects me except you. No one told me to cherish myself, and no one taught me how to love someone else. Before I met you, I didn't know how. I was so childish, wasn't I? I'm sorry, brother. I just wanted so badly to prove that you'd always love me." His temples were damp, his voice a murmured dream. "Brother, don't leave me. Don't give up on me. Teach me. I'll try my best to learn. I'll learn from you how to love you." His pillow was soaked with tears. He was made of water, through and through. I reached out, stroked his head, and hugged him back, sighing. "All right, enough. Go to sleep, cry baby." The next morning, Mark was summoned back to H-City by a single call from Thomas. I stayed in D-City, drinking tea, playing cards and watching sunsets. A peaceful life fit for a retiree. Whenever Mark had free time, he'd come to D-City. When he was here, I'd keep him company, listen to him talk. When he left, I didn't try to stop him. I went back to my tea, cards, and sunsets. One time, as he was leaving, Mark said, "Brother, I feel like you don't love me as much as you used to." I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He was already 26, but the way he looked at me was just as fervent and insecure as when he was 18. I knew what Mark Salem wanted to hear, but I couldn't say it, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I gave too much, he'd start taking me for granted again. I didn't have the strength to be wasted anymore. Still, I wanted to be honest. I said, "Mark Salem, it's not that I don't love you anymore. It's that I'm scared because you've lied to me too many times. You're so desperate to confirm my love, but have you ever thought that I might feel insecure too?" Mark looked at me for a moment, then leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine until our noses touched. "It's okay, brother," he said. "It doesn't matter. You don't have to love me that much. Just stand here and let me love you instead." Later, Mark Salem had a falling out with Thomas Salem. The reason? Mark took me to another country, dragging along the family register, and married me. That night, Thomas called D-City. Mark leaned against the balcony railing, getting scolded over the phone. Thomas's muffled voice carried over. "If you like him, just keep him. Why get married?" Mark replied, "What kind of decent person gets married without a certificate?" Thomas was furious. "He's a man. Dad, he's old-fashioned. Without that certificate, he won't feel secure." Then Mark added, "This has nothing to do with him being a man or a woman. I love him, and I want to make him feel safe. It's as simple as that. You've never loved anyone, and you've never been loved by anyone, so you wouldn't understand." Thomas Salem started yelling louder. The night was quiet, and his outburst was crystal clear. But after all that, Thomas gave in. Later, Thomas called me directly. Bill, you've got some skill. In his whole life, Mark has only lowered his head to me twice. Both times, it was for you. If it weren't for protecting you, he wouldn't have called me dad again. I smiled faintly, narrowed my eyes, and said softly, I don't have any special skills, boss. You just wouldn't understand. Looking up, I saw Mark on the balcony, fussing with my nearly dead potted plants. I called out, Mark. He turned around. I love you, I said. Mark Salem's eyes lit up instantly, just like they had when he was 18.